Good day. For those of you who don't know us, we're the instructional staff for EC 150, Professors Hiran Patel and Werner Dietl, and Douglas Harder. In this topic, we're going to discuss the default values of parameters. In this topic, we will describe how parameters can be given default values. We will learn the rules under which parameters can be given default values and how it is used in applications. We will also look at a few examples. Now, up to this point, when a function is called, the function call must have an argument for each parameter. And when the function executes, the initial value of the parameter is the value that is passed in the corresponding argument. Now, in some cases, some parameters may have obvious default values, which perhaps the user doesn't always need to specify. So in this case, the corresponding arguments are only needed if they differ from this default value. This is slightly nicer because it results in cleaner function calls. There's fewer arguments, and if it's clear what the subsequent default values are anyway, it makes for cleaner code. Now there is an issue, however. The programmer reading the code must be aware that the function does indeed have default values. Now, these are also called default arguments or optional parameters. I guess they could also be called optional arguments as well, if you want to include all possibilities and combinations. Now, if a function has n parameters, the last m, where m is less than or equal to n parameters, can be given default values. It is easiest to show this by example. Here we have a function sum. Now, the first two parameters are as per normal. I and j are each declared to be of type int, and that's it. So these two parameters are required. These last three parameters, however, have default values, and the default values are specified using the assignment operator. And so now we have the function declaration that has the default values. Below this, you see the function definition, which just sums in this case, the values of the 5 parameters and returns that. Now, given the declaration of this particular function sum, we note that any function call requires at least 2 arguments. However, no function call can have more than 5 arguments. So you can call this function with 2, 3, 4, or 5 arguments. The kth argument is always the initial value of the kth parameter. If there are fewer than k arguments and the kth parameter does have a default value, the parameter takes on that default value when the function is called. Note, by this definition, it's a necessary consequence that if the kth parameter has a default value, then so must all subsequent parameters. So here's an example. We're using this function sum, and I commented out this first function call because it wouldn't compile. It only calls sum with 1 argument. In this case, 1 plus 2 is the calculation that results from the sum of the first of the 2 arguments, but then 5, 7, and 11 are the default values for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th arguments. If the user provides 3 arguments, then those 3 arguments are used and only the 4th and 5th parameters take on their default values. Same here. The user has provided 4 arguments, therefore the first 4 parameters take on the values of these 4 arguments, and only the 5th parameter takes on its default value, and here all the parameters take on the values of the corresponding arguments. I've commented this function call out because this will not compile. There are only 5 arguments for this function call. Now, usually the default parameter should be something that's obvious given the type. So default values for ints or doubles are usually 0. For a bool, it's usually false. For the character, you can probably use a null character, and for a string, you can use the empty string. Occasionally, you may use a value like -1 or not a number, which is in the C math library, where it is declared as a constant. These two values can be used to indicate that the user has nominally not supplied a default value. Now, interestingly enough, the default value can also be an expression. It doesn't have to be a constant, and it can also include function calls that then calculate the default value if the user does not provide a corresponding argument. Now, here is my sign function, except I'm including a second parameter using degrees, and its default value is false. So now the user can call my sign either assuming that x has units of radians or x having units of degrees. Now, if the user only calls my sign with one argument, that's the value of x, and using degrees will be set to false, in which case this conditional statement does not execute. Instead, the balance of the function is simply executed and sign of x is approximated, again assuming it's between 0 and pi/2. If, however, the user provides a second argument true, then this condition is true, and therefore x is multiplied by the number of radians per degree. So suppose the user called this with x equaling 90 and using degrees where the second argument was true. Well, in this case, 90 would be multiplied by pi divided by 180, which would be at least approximately pi/2. The balance of the function works as per normal because now x has been converted from a unit in degrees into a unit of radians. So, following this topic, you now understand the use and application of default values for parameters. You know the syntax. All parameters after the first with a default value must be given a default value. They can't be skipped, and the default values should be obvious. Here's the references, the colophon, and a disclaimer. Cheers!